Hi everyone, my name's Dr. Jennifer O'Brien. I work at the University of Manchester in and around climate change and sustainability. It's a real honour to share some thoughts with you today. Thank you so much for welcoming me here. Sorry that we can't discuss in person. I hope we get to meet one day soon. I have a broad brief for today, and I have to apologise a little bit. I've been working in this field for all of my life. I can only share a few ideas with you today, plant a few seeds if you like, and it's a broad remit. So I'd like to talk to you a little bit about climate change, and I talk about change for two reasons. Firstly, that I often refer to climate emergencies or catastrophes rather than change. That's mainly because we are facing a real urgent challenge. We need to act quickly. And I also refer to change because there is a natural climatic change that we overlook. I'm going to explain this in more detail momentarily, but it's very normal for our climate to change. Indeed, it's very important that we have that climate change. And I'm also going to share with you a little bit today about the glocal, as I call them, the global to local impacts, but then in turn, the things that we can collectively do together to create a more sustainable world. Okay, so first, very important point to understand, and I have to confess it took me longer to appreciate this than I care to admit. So our world is complex and it's interlinked. There are all of these different systems happening all the time. There is a meteorological or a weather system. There's a hydrological system, that's water. There's tectonic activity. There are different flows of wind, of waves. It's constantly changing. And all of those structures, as I'll show you in a second, relate to each other. And that change is very, very normal. We need to have those continuous changes to sustain the climate that the world has always had long before human beings. And as I say, all of those systems are very, very interlinked, as this diagram is trying to show. So before there were humans on the planet, which I appreciate is difficult to consider, if there was a big cloudburst, that water would go into rivers, it would go out into the streams and into the oceans. We may have increased evaporation, for example. There could then be a change in solar inputs, but it was a system, a closed system. If a volcano erupted, yes, there might be more emissions and ash into the atmosphere. A lot of people say that's contributed towards climate change, but there'd also be some tectonic shifts elsewhere. So it was all in balance, it was all in flux. The difference then is when there were human influences. So I appreciate it's difficult to imagine a world without human beings, but in actual fact, we have only been on the planet for a very small period of its overall existence. So if you're a fan of Jurassic Park, the Jurassic era was during the Mesozoic period. We've had all these different time frames, all the way up to where the time of humans up here, which many people now refer to as the Anthropocene. So anthro meaning man or human, scene being era, so the era of man or human. Not just because we existed on the world, but this is the period in time in which some people argue there was the greatest impact on those natural systems that were there. And that has accelerated over time. So we talk about the great acceleration through the Industrial Revolution, very big in Manchester, of course, but then this increase, this rapid acceleration from around 1950, when there was a growth in pretty much everything. Population growth increased dramatically, as you can see in the top graph there, and this boom, this acceleration from 1950. Increase in cars, perhaps as a result of that population. So cars that put the greatest amount of emissions into the atmosphere, second only perhaps to aircraft. International tourism has also increased, but cars that then change the shape of cities, for example, essential for moving items and people around, but they can have a real negative effect on the environment. Urban population increased. Cities are fascinating when it comes to sustainability, as the problems, the perpetrator, as we call them, the victims, but also the potential solutions of climate change in cities. Even an increase in Mackie D's. So more of this dramatic increase in McDonald's restaurants, perhaps then indicating a greater reliance on beef and impacts then on deforestation, for example. A fast food industry, which then had lots of disposable wrappings, for example. But overall, this huge acceleration, this big increase in our impact on the natural and the social world from around the 1950s. Now, all of these changes we can see very clearly represented in historical climatic change data. So this is a graph that's been taken from tree rings, or it's been generated through tree rings and through historical records and ice cores. It's very famous. It's known as the hockey stick graph because of the shape here of the acceleration of temperature change towards 2000. So you can see the natural fluctuation that I mentioned earlier, again, very normal for the climate to change, but this sudden increase and dramatic increase into much higher temperatures towards 2000 onwards. This has been recognised in all sorts of different data now. We know that we are experiencing periods of climate change due to anthropogenic action. And what this does is it increases the greenhouse effect. Now, forgive me if you are an expert in the greenhouse effect, and if you're not, let me just share with you a little bit of an overview of how it works. So it's the idea that our world needs some level of protection. We need some level of gas around our planet to maintain the climatic conditions that we know. But a good friend of mine, Dr. Mark Hudson, referred to the greenhouse effect as being like having a duvet on. So you get your duvet on, you're all comfy, and everything's okay. But then you think, oh, maybe I'm a little bit cold, and you get another duvet and you put it across yourself. And at that moment in time, that extra blanket, for a second, it's really cozy, but really quickly you get too hot. And what then if you've borrowed that blanket from your little brother or your little sister, and they're getting cold? And that is essentially the impact of the greenhouse. We need to have some level of protection, some level of a duvet to keep us warm. But over time, with anthropogenic or human action, the thickness of those gases in some cases has increased, in some cases has decreased. That's adding an extra duvet, that's taking it away. And it means that our climate is changing. It's getting warmer in some places, getting wetter in others, it's getting colder. And this is already having dramatic impacts on people and on place. So to give you just a few examples, many of which have happened recently across the world. So the top one here is showing you the ice changes in the Indian Himalayas into Nepal as well. From 1921, where there's mass coverage of snow and ice, through to 2009, where there's just more water. So increased temperature has caused the ice to melt. Mussels that have washed up on seashores, pre-cooked by the warmth of the water. In Jingzhou in China last September, an entire month's worth of rainfall fell in a single day, causing these real flash floods. If the ground is already dry or it's already saturated, there's not enough space to take this extra water, you get this dramatic flooding. Wildfires that were seen across a lot of America and also in some in Canada, where the ground was really, really dry already due to drought, lack of rainfall, a spark maybe from a barbecue or from a cigarette. And the problem there is there's less water to put it out. Burning the trees removes the trees that are taking carbon out of the atmosphere, but it also releases all the carbon that they have sequestered. And also, of course, you get the ash and you get the smoke, and not to mention the impact on people and their properties. This is a really interesting example down here. It's a monument in Delhi, in India, which normally is obstructed, or you can't see it very well because of the smog of air quality. I'm obsessed with air quality. I think it's going to be our next big health awareness. So normally you can't see it because of all the particles that are hanging in the air. Really interestingly, during the pandemic, when everyone was locked down, when there was less manufacturing, there was less vehicles, the air became a lot clearer, a lot cleaner, and you can actually see the monument. But the other thing that's happening is we're getting lots more impact on human beings as well. So these kind of climatic impacts on the natural world then impact on humans. So there's an image here of some climate refugees in Sudan. I was recently also talking to an NGO, a non-governmental organization who work in Bangladesh, who are supporting the increasing number of migrants that are leaving more rural areas and coming down to cities, to urban spaces. There's been a real increase in child labour, for example, where families have left farmland, they need to make money, children have been taken out of school. What else are they going to do but to work, to earn money, and for them to buy food and then for them to eat, of course, with dramatic impacts on the family then. So we know that this is happening, but sustainability, climate change, or mitigating climate change is incredibly complex, and it relies on a balance. It relies on thinking about how all of these different interactions fit together. So that might be represented through plastics. Real focus on single-use plastics. Plastics is a wonder product. Plastics has revolutionized medicine, for example, manufacturing in all sorts of different ways, but it's human misuse of plastic which is causing the problem. And images there like the seahorse holding onto the cotton bud. There's a very distinct link between our impact on the natural world, so deforestation, for example, and how that feeds through to the social world, maybe through densities in cities, for example, or the work that I do in and around sustainable development. I'm really interested in questions of social justice, how they then impact on the environment, questions of gender, questions of Indigenous knowledges, for example, and how it all comes together. And it does come together. This is the really important bit, the idea of the interlinkages. And this is where I'm going to bring just a little bit of governance in to share with you our history around sustainable development. So when we are thinking about a sustainable level of growth, because as human beings, when we evolved on the planet, we needed to grow. We need to build, we need to travel, we need to manufacture, we need to export. And it's an interesting point that ML makes here, that everything we use to communicate, to move, to stay still, to sit, sleep, cook, etc., comes from resources. We need to use things in order to just maintain ourselves, let alone to do more, which I think is a very important and undervalued point. The challenge to me, or to my mind then, is how we can do it in a more sustainable way. And it comes back to this image here. Sustainable development that we have in the middle balances people, profit, and planet. So we need to think about the planet. And this is the Bruntwood Our Common Future report that was created in 1987, which says that sustainable development is development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. What that means is that we need to develop in a way in which we are not over-exploiting the earth and we are leaving something for next generations. And that means balancing out this sometimes quite complex Venn diagram here. And that's also where the pandemic has changed things for us quite a lot. So to give you a really good example, during the pandemic, aviation emissions, so the emissions from planes, reduced hugely, which would have had a long-term knock-on effect on global warming, because there are just fewer planes flying, fewer people going on holiday, less movement of goods and of people. But post-pandemic, we need to resurrect the tourist industry that employs hundreds of thousands of people globally. We need to make that profit in order for people to feed their families and to think about ways in which we can share knowledges, think about ecotourism, things like that. It's not just a question of protecting the planet. We're constantly thinking about these different elements. So it's complex and it needs a little bit more thought at times, I think. So in terms of that thought, what can you do? All sorts of things is my immediate answer. And this stems from the fact that, yes, the world is complex. We know our human impacts on the world, and therefore we know how we can reduce them, how we can mitigate against them, and also how we can undo some of the impacts that we have had. And it's exactly because our world is so interlinked and all of these systems speak to each other that we can affect change. So small changes that you will make will scale up to that global phenomenon because they're all interlinked. Small actions do add up. So what can you do? So to my mind, this all stems from that quote I used before by ML that says, we have to use resources. Everything that we do requires resources. So let's think practically about different ways in which we can approach them. And I don't know if you've heard about the 6 R's. It used to be reduce, reuse, recycle when I was your age, but now 3 more R's have been added to that triptych. And it's actually starting from this process. Can we rethink? Can we do this differently? Do we need to do that? Which also then makes sort of links through to the next R, which is just to refuse. Can we say, no, don't need that, don't need to do that, I'll step away from it. Repairing. How many things can we fix? We live in a disposable world where often it's quicker, it can even be cheaper just to buy the same thing new again. Gone are the skills that I remember my grandma trying to share with me around darning socks or stitching buttons back on clothes, and repairing, lawn mowers, that sort of thing. We've lost those skills in fixing things and making them better in preference of a consumable, disposable culture of just buying the new thing. That then adds more to landfill, for example. We then have problems with pollution, with leaching of plastics. Again, everything is linked. Can we just reduce? Can we just do less? Use fewer materials? Can we make houses that have more smart materials? That means we can just use less. Can we think about how we could reuse items in different ways? Can your single-use water bottles become plant pots? Can we think cleverly and creatively about reusing materials? And then at the end, we have recycle. I'm going to come back to recycle because I think it's one of the areas that we have always taken for granted a little bit, but needs a bit more critical thought. I'll come back to that one in a second. But this, to my mind, is summarised in this image here, which is made by Friends of the Earth, that suggests that the best things that we can do are to think about what we consume. So how we eat, how we travel, the energy that we use, and also this bit in the middle, making sure that others are aware as well. So in terms of consumption, like immediate eating, for example, reducing how much meat you eat will have a dramatic impact. Now, very important take-home point, I think, is I'm not suggesting that you should all become veggie or you should all become vegan. This is about reducing. It's doing a little bit less. So there's a line here from Nature, it's one of the big international science journals, that says if everyone in the country reduced their consumption of beef, pork and poultry just by a quarter and substituted them with plant proteins, we would save 82 million metric tons of greenhouse gas emissions every year. So it is about just making small changes. As I say, I'm not saying go vegan, never eat meat again, but just eat one meal of meat less a week. And that's where things like meat-free Mondays come in, as lots of organisations now do. And I think that's really important when it comes to change for sustainability, that change has to be sustainable. It has to be something that you can keep up and do over and over and over again. And that's where the small actions add up. Transport is the other one, and I think it really reflects the challenges of sustainable development. So this is a map, this is Greater Manchester's map, the cycling and walking vision that was laid out by Andy Burnham, our mayor, very much trying to get more people active, reducing car use, particularly for short journeys. So if it's a distance that you could walk or you could cycle, why get into the car? Why not take a more active measure, which is good for you, it's good for the planet, it saves you money. Think back to that triple bottom line of sustainable development, so the three together. But there is an argument that walking and cycling isn't necessarily accessible for everybody. How can we get more people walking and cycling? Is there a challenge of poor infrastructure? Would you cycle to school, for example, on your local roads? Are there enough alternatives for people to take public transport where they're going rather than getting in their car? Is it accessible? Are the buses too expensive? Are the trains reliable? How can we encourage people to use more sustainable, less polluting forms of transport, even down to car sharing? So a single car with one person in, it's one person. A bus could take 35 people and doesn't have much of a greater emission output than that car. The other really interesting area to consider, particularly at the moment, is around our energy, and particularly heating and lighting. Right now, while energy prices are quite so expensive, this is even more poignant. Again, triple bottom line of sustainability. Alternative forms of energy can be more expensive. They are a bigger investment, particularly around things like heat pumps, ground source heat pumps, which are so popular at the moment. We don't yet have the learning as to whether or not they are sustainable long term, whether they maintain their efficiency, for example, but they are significantly better for the planet than fossil fuels, than using coal, using gas, which obviously are finite resources and contribute to greenhouse gases. This is where it's really controversial. I don't know if you saw in the news this week that the government have just approved the opening of the first coal mine in 30 years, which is in Cumbria. There's an image there that I just lifted from the newspaper articles of this week. It's really controversial, and it also illustrates, to my mind, the challenges of sustainability. So on the one hand, nationally produced energy should be cheaper. It should bring lots of jobs to the area. But this is an unprecedented disaster for environmental sustainability, to my mind. We should not be investing in fossil fuel energy in nearly 2023. But as I say, a good example of the challenges that we face in sustainable development. Just as an example of more efficient energy, actually, next time you're in town, I don't know if you've seen this very curious building over towards, well, the GMET, because I used to know it, but it's now called the Manchester Central Convention Centre. This really interesting, intricate building. It's actually part of the Civic Quarter heat network, which is making sustainable heat and power. And it's an interlinked network system that can grow. But it's the idea that our public buildings, such as the Town Hall, the Bridgewater Hall and the Art Gallery, will be heated using sustainable heating. Next time you're in town, you can go and see it. They have a big viewing window where you can see the big boilers and how it's all connected. So there are some really interesting efforts being made in Manchester to be more sustainable. And just the final example I just wanted to get you thinking about a little bit is the difference between reducing and recycling. So certainly when I was at school, there was a big focus on recycling, and recycling was more sustainable. But I think we need to think critically about it. So for some people, recycling is really quite complicated. It's difficult to know necessarily what each of the bins do. I also worry that we tend to draw upon recycling as our go-to. So if in doubt, we'll just pop it into recycling. When in actual fact, recycling costs an awful lot. It's expensive to recycle. It uses a lot of energy. It tends to, as I say, lull us into a false sense of security that we can just recycle that item. Also, there are challenges of human behavior. So if you contaminate a paper bin with something that is dirty, then the entire bin cannot go to recycling. And then finally, for me, the big focus needs to be on our physical environment. So how can we protect the environment that we have and indeed plant more? We lose more and more of our green space to urban infrastructure, to car parks, to pavements. How can we rewild? How can we plant more? How can we plant more food, more pollinators to bring birds and to bring butterflies and protect our biodiversity? So in sum, thank you so much for listening to me for the last 20 minutes or so. Please take away the interlinked points that our world is all interlinked. And as a result, small actions do add up. We are facing a bit of an emergency. We need to work together and we need to work hard, but you have the power to affect change as well. Thank you so much.